Good afternoon. I'm Michelle Woods, Vice President of RAND's Homeland Security Research Division, which operates the Homeland Security Operation Analysis Center, a federally funded research and development center, or FFRDC, that supports the Department of Homeland Security. On behalf of HSRD, I'd like to welcome you to today's important discussion about the risk climate change poses to critical infrastructure and what strategies could mitigate those risks. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. We are recording today's event, and that recording will be posted to the HSRD website next week. We will take your questions through Slido, and the link is in your confirmation email as well as in the chat. I'd like to thank the FFRDC Program Management Office at the Department of Homeland Security for their support of our continued external communications efforts. With that, I'll now turn to our conversation today. In 2021, President Biden signed an executive order directing the Secretary of Homeland Security to consider the implications of climate change in the Arctic, along our nation's borders, and to critical infrastructure across the country. To fulfill the objectives of the executive order, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, asked HSOAC to develop a risk management framework and to assess risk of climate change to those pieces of critical infrastructure deemed at higher risk. It is now my pleasure to introduce the team that led this project. Andy Lawlin, Michelle Muro, Susan Resitar, and Rahim Ali. Over the past several years, they have produced a suite of research reports, as well as an interactive tool which sought to inform CISA's efforts at protecting critical infrastructure from the impacts of climate change. Today's conversation will explore what they have learned, how they've come to think about the interconnected challenges of climate change and critical infrastructure protection, and what mitigation efforts are currently underway. Thank you again for joining us today. Over to you, Michelle.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Vice President Woods, for the introduction. So I'll be serving as the moderator for our discussion this afternoon, and I'm just going to kick things off with a bit of context before turning over to the panel. So as probably many of y'all know, if you're interested in these topics, every year we're hitting records for climate disasters and really the costs associated with them. We can think about the August 2023 fires in Maui, ongoing drought in the Colorado River Basin that's resulted in record low water levels in places like Lake Powell and other major reservoirs, significant flooding in California from really a barrage of atmospheric rivers over the last 2 years. Thinking back a little bit more, snowstorms in Buffalo, and on the other end of the spectrum, the heat dome in the Southwest that maybe affected many of y'all on the call today. That checks the box for really a large breadth of the United States and a number of different climate hazards. And each of these, and many of the ones that I didn't mention, have had major impacts on individuals, as well as, important for our discussion today, the critical infrastructure that supports our health, our safety, and the economy of the United States. As we look ahead to the future, and as the frequency and magnitude of many of these hazards are projected to grow, climate change will pose a major risk to the United States. The need to understand how these risks might play out over the coming century was included in the executive order that Vice President Woods mentioned, and was one of the motivators for the work that we're going to talk about during the discussion today. Since the executive order was issued, we've been working with DHS and specifically the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, on these topics. We're now finishing up the third year of our work. We've really focused on assessing the risks posed to U.S. critical infrastructure by climate change. And each year we've looked at a number of different things, but in broad strokes, how are climate hazards projected to change out to 2050 and 2100? What vulnerabilities exist among U.S. critical infrastructure systems? And then what does that mean together? And so we've pulled those two pieces of information together to produce ratings of future climate risk for a set of 55 different critical infrastructure systems, termed by CISA as the national critical functions. And that's where we're going to start with our conversation today. And we'll also explore the main findings and themes of our work. So as Vice President Wood already mentioned, I'm joined by my colleagues, Andrew Lawland and Susan Resitar. The three of us co-led this work. And last but not least, Rahim Ali, who's one of our subject matter experts leading the analysis on many of the important national critical functions. So Andy, turning to you first, what are national critical functions? What does it mean to take a functional approach to critical infrastructure? And what does that matter in the context of climate change?
Sure. So in order to do work like this, one of the things that you've got to define is infrastructure. What are you talking about when you talk about critical infrastructure? And up until 2019, the traditional approach to looking at infrastructure had been to see the world in sectors. So there were 16 formal sectors. So for example, transportation was a sector, government facilities was a sector. And if you take that name, government facilities, it's got facility buried in the name, which is a clue to the way that we looked at infrastructure, which was really to look at physical assets, to look at buildings, to look at things that are brick and mortar. And about April of 2019, so about a year before the pandemic, which winds up being very important, DHS released a set of 55 national critical functions. And so a functional approach to infrastructure is, instead of thinking about sectors and assets, think about what are the functions that makes the country the country. What are the functions that are so critical that if they were disrupted, if you couldn't do those functions, it would have a serious negative effect on national security, the economy, health and safety. So under a functional approach, you have things like preserve constitutional rights. You have things like educate and train. So if you contrast that to the sector-based approach, schools were in government facilities and they were looked at as buildings. So the pandemic arrives, and this is one of the reasons that I will always be a proponent of the functional approach. When the pandemic arrives, we couldn't use our school buildings. So we shifted to virtual learning. So if we were using this old framework of looking at buildings, you'd say, well, the pandemic didn't really have an effect on the buildings. It didn't damage the buildings. It made them uninhabitable. But what really matters is the function, is that were you able to educate and train the way that you wanted to? And that actually changed a lot. So it really changed the way that we were able to perceive risk. And this was an earlier study that we did for DHS on COVID and the national critical functions. So you fast forward to climate change. Using a functional approach to climate change, the focus, again, is on, can you do the things that you want to do? Well, if you're in a sector-based approach, you're thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about all of the other inputs that you have from other players that might be important and might be pivotal on whether or not you can execute that function. So I mentioned before these two examples of government facilities and transportation. Well, what do you need to get kids to school? You need transportation. What do you need to get buses to schools? You need roads that are open. You need all these other things that are outside of your control. So taking a functional approach, first and foremost, gives you the ability to think about these interdependencies in a way that a more sector-based approach, I think, does not. Another thing that it does is it puts other sorts of threats and hazards on the board. So if you're solely thinking about assets, you're really going to be thinking about physical damage and disruption. So you might be thinking with regard to climate change. Well, am I on the coast? Am I in a floodplain? But we know there are all of these other things that can happen. We've got a couple of us that are either from Texas or have family in Texas. I'll tell you, when it is, 120-degree heat index, people are not working outside the hours that they were working before. And that is having an effect on critical functions like building housing and construction and maintaining infrastructure. So this functional approach, it really gets to the heart of the matter, which is, can you do the things that you need to do? So the last thing that I will say, which is the reason that I'm a proponent of this approach, is when you have a problem as wicked as climate change, being termed an existential threat, correctly so by many, I think the more lenses that you have to look at that problem and to attack it, the better. So there is certainly room for a sector-based approach, but a functional-based approach gives you all of these other different angles and perspectives that you might not have without it. So that's how I would describe a functional approach, and that's why I'm a big proponent of including it in the suite of analysis on climate change risk.
Thanks, Andy. Sue, we'll go to you next to talk more broadly about our approach to the project. So could you talk about how we assess the risks from climate change on this functional approach to critical infrastructure, on the national critical functions?
Sure. So, you both have touched on some of the important features of what we had to consider when we tried to assess risk from climate change. First of which, we were looking at these 55 important functions for the United States. So we had to develop a structured method to do so. So the structured method that we developed considers the pathway by which a climate hazard would disrupt routine operations of these functions. And again, 55 different diverse functions, as Andy has indicated, giving you some examples. So we first had to focus on the exposure. What is the exposure of these functions to climate hazards? And so we've had to characterize 8 climate hazards. We came up with 8 that are commonly used in analysis in the National Climate Assessment. So these are sea level rise, drought, floods, hurricanes, wildfire, and extreme heat or extreme cold, and severe storm systems. So we settled on most of these are distinct events, with the exception of sea level rise. So we characterized those, and we had to look at what the projections are, because climate will affect sort of the frequency and severity of these 8 climate hazards. So we did some analysis of the outputs from global circulation models, as well as analysis of research studies, to first kind of characterize, where are these hazards going in the future? And we looked in 2 time frames besides the baseline of today. We looked at 2050 and 2100. And then we also considered 2 kinds of emission scenarios, a current emission scenario and a high emission scenario. So that's to try to bound the problem space, if you will, or the level of exposure that these 55 critical functions could be exposed to. And then to consider sort of this risk of disruption, we had to think about the pathway. So how does a climate hazard affect a function? And the most obvious sort of first choice is through physical damage or some kind of a physical disruption. So there's damage to your asset or your facility, but it also could be that it's just the sort of the climate is that you cannot operate. So for example, if in extreme heat, aircraft may not be able to fly, they may be grounded. So that's what this physical impact mechanism we call encompasses. But again, we considered other impact mechanisms, other pathways. Another one is sort of the demand function, right? If demand of your function is changing because of a climate hazard, either increasing, surging, or becoming volatile, or even declining to the point where you can't operate, that could be another pathway. So an example of how that works in our analysis is one of the functions is to provide housing. And that essentially looks at sort of the construction of either permanent or temporary shelter. And after a climate hazard, there could be an increase in demand on providing housing. And that would strain sort of your material supply chains, your construction labor, and then having a kind of an effect on increase in higher material costs, labor shortages, essentially delays to reconstruction that disrupt that function. So that demand change is another impact mechanism that we considered. And then the third standard one, I should say, is through workforce shortages. So there might be times when when a function has a lot of outdoor activity. You could think, agriculture, even distribution systems where there's a lot of loading docks and that sort of thing, a lot of outside work. And that would not potentially be even possible because of a climate hazard, or would you would experience productivity loss. So that could result in a disruption to your function. And then we allowed for sort of a fill in the blank, if you will, because there is a diverse set and we want to be comprehensive here. But those were the 3 that we identified as being, pretty primary as far as an impact mechanism. And then I just wanted to note that we are looking at the risk of disruption. We're not necessarily looking at all the consequences that could result from disruption, but that is how we characterize risk. And so we use a risk rating scheme of 1 to 5, 1 representing minimal disruption, to 5, which is severe or catastrophic disruption. And that is consistent with some of the operational level framework that CISA uses. And you can kind of scale it depending on your application. So we've developed some guidelines for the analysis, and then we present, how it was applied for each of these functions. So to some, we assess the sort of the risk. We consider the exposure, sort of that impact mechanism, any particular vulnerabilities or resistance to that impact mechanism to determine the effect on routine operations. And that is what is reflected in these risk ratings that we've reported on. And then lastly, I will say those are the direct effects, and we acknowledge that there are potential for cascading effects from other critical functions. One obvious example is supply water. If water is not available, that will disrupt agricultural operations. But those are 2 separate functions. And so that is what we call a dependency. So that we treated dependencies separately just because of the availability of information. And we know there are connections. And when we saw connections, we identified those connections where the risk was of moderate level or higher. So we call that out separately because of those limitations. And then finally, we've done this at the national scale for a couple of years, and those are publicly available reports. And then most recently, we have looked at 2 regions. We've done it at the regional scale. So when we talk about our risk ratings today, we're talking about nationally, what is the risk? And then knowing that we can also have the capability to go at a lower scale, at a regional scale. We just don't have those publicly available today. So I think that's how we approach this. So back to you, Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. So what I want to do next is zoom in to a couple specific critical infrastructure systems, or NCFs, and turn to Rahim now. So Rahim, can you talk a bit about what you found in your analysis of a few of the specific NCFs, or national critical functions, that you examined, and also touch on what drove the risk in that analysis?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Michelle. So as an analyst on the team, I was responsible for assessing risk to 3 critical functions. And I think one critical function that really serves as a good example to answer this question is the critical function related to the development and maintenance of public works and services. So when we think about the development and maintenance of public works and services, it's primarily focused on the design, construction, and maintenance of infrastructure to supply government services such as transportation systems, waste management systems, water supply, and public buildings. So we assessed this critical function as being at risk of minimal disruption currently, but increasing to moderate disruption by the middle and end of the century due to climate drivers. So an example of a minimal disruption could be that flooding washes away a road, making it inaccessible or unusable, but repairs or reconstruction of the road could be implemented in a timely manner. On the other hand, a moderate disruption would mean that the construction and maintenance of public works infrastructure, such as a road, experiences considerable delays or is potentially halted due to climate drivers. And there's really 2 factors that contribute to this risk. The first is physical damage to infrastructure systems and assets. There's numerous examples from previous disasters that highlight how climate drivers such as hurricanes, flooding, and wildfire can cause damage to infrastructure serving public works. For example, during Hurricane Ian in 2022, several cities in Florida experienced damage to their public works facilities, which required hundreds of $millions for repairs and, in some cases, reconstruction of new facilities. And so as these climate drivers, such as hurricanes, are projected to increase with frequency and intensity in the future, there's likely to be more instances where infrastructure and assets can be damaged, leading to potential disruptions in the ability to effectively build infrastructure for government services. The second factor contributing to the risk is an increase in demand of maintenance activities. So climate drivers such as extreme heat, drought, and sea level rise can increase the need for maintenance of infrastructure systems serving public works and services. New York City is a good example, where the New York City subway system is currently experiencing billions of dollars in deferred maintenance, and effects from sea level rise and extreme heat will add to these repair and maintenance costs. And so as climate drivers such as sea level rise and extreme heat are projected to increase in the future, cities, local governments, and other municipalities may become overwhelmed in their ability to effectively manage their transportation systems or water systems, or public buildings, or other government services. And one last point I'd like to make with regards to kind of the analysis of critical functions is that certain sub-functions kind of primarily drove the risk rating. So in the case of developing and maintaining public works and services, it comprised of 5 sub-functions, which were related to the construction and maintenance of transportation systems, utility systems, public buildings, recreation spaces, and community revitalization. In our analysis, we found that most of these sub-functions were assessed as being at risk of moderate disruption due to climate drivers. But there was one sub-function specifically related to community revitalization, where we found that there were currently no disruptions, and it was assessed that this sub-function would experience minimal disruptions in the future. So within a given NCF or critical function, there are certain sub-functions that might experience more disruptions than others, and those sub-functions might drive more of the risk rating for a given critical function.
Thanks, Raheem, and great point. And thanks for bringing up the sub-functions. The way these systems are defined by CISA includes kind of a general description of the national critical function, but then a number of sub-functions. And so in our risk assessment, we looked at both levels of these kind of infrastructure systems in our analysis. Sue, we're going to turn back to you next to kind of zoom back out. So Raheem, those were some great examples of how we kind of approach the risk assessment and how it played out for a number of these systems, and specifically, I guess, with public works, although that one is quite broad, as you mentioned, and touches on a number of other infrastructure, utilities, water, et cetera. So Sue, zooming back out at the national scale, could you kind of walk us through some of the key findings of the analysis?
Sure. So I'll kind of give you sort of like the highlights of the summary. Just to kind of point out in our report, we have a lot more detail on each of the critical functions along the lines of what you've heard from Raheem. And so just know that there's a lot of information behind what I'm about to say. So that is available. So of the 55 critical functions, we found that 45 will have some effects from climate hazards. So, so in our terminology, this is at risk of minimal disruption from climate hazards by 2050 under the current emissions. So this is sort of the baseline case, if you will, fairly near term when you're talking about long-term investments. And so at least minimal disruption. So while a vast majority or a significant majority are affected by climate change, there's still a pretty good number that will continue to meet operational needs. So there might be minor damage to a facility or an asset or a small degradation, noticeable degradation in the function, but they will still be able to meet what's routine operational needs. When we kind of throttle back a little bit or throttle up a little bit and we think of a moderate level of disruption, so this would be a level 3 in our 1 to 5 rating scale, close to half, 25, are at risk of moderate disruption by 2050 under current emissions. And so in some parts of the country, 25 critical functions may not be able to meet routine operational needs. And this grows as you kind of go out on the timeline. when thinking about what are the significant impacts, you think we found that there were three functions that are at risk of what we call major or critical disruption by 2100. And that is providing information technology and services, products and services, maintaining supply chains, and supply water. So these three functions are at risk of being disrupted to the point where they might not be able to meet routine operational needs in a majority or most of the country. Again, this was done at the national scale. There were, on the flip side, on the other side of the spectrum, there were about 7 to 10 functions, and these are primarily related to financial services or internet and networking operations. They're not really at risk of direct effects from climate change in either time periods. And that's largely because they're either decentralized or virtual systems that provide the service, or they have, if they, what infrastructure they have, it either has enough redundancy or is sited in areas that are not really largely exposed. So that's sort of the good news of the coin, if you will. There's a significant portion that are relatively insensitive to the climate drivers. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we did try to address sort of that cascading or those interdependencies among the critical functions. So we looked at we looked at this in sort of two ways. I mentioned those 7 to 10 NCFs that are relatively insensitive from direct effects from climate change, and that's what we found. But if you look at their functional dependency, if you look at critical functions or NCFs that are what we call upstream, that provide an important input or service to these 7. These 7 are dependent on at least 6 other functions that were rated at risk of moderate disruption. So while they might have been rated at a 1, if you think about what they're waiting for in terms of inputs and services from other functions, they have 6 functions that are at level 3 or higher that they are requiring inputs. Now, we couldn't characterize, we didn't have information. We know there's a connection. We don't know if risk could actually cascade. Maybe there's some buffering effect there or some contingencies. There's a lot that kind of goes into understanding that connection. And so we can only kind of note that there's, a lot of upstream NCFs that are at moderate or higher risk. And then on the flip side, we looked at the NCFs that affect a large number of other NCFs. So they have a lot of what we call downstream functional connections. So there were 4 NCFs at risk of moderate disruption or greater that have a relationship with all the other NCFs. So each one is related, provides some kind of a service or input to 54 other functions. And those 4 provide information technology, products and services, maintaining supply chains, prepare for and manage emergencies, which might not be, something that people are thinking about, and providing medical care. So we highlight that these 4 have, kind of an outside, a potential to cascade down to many, many other functions. And then there were another 4 actually that maybe didn't have downstream connections to all of the other NCFs, but they had a pretty significant influence on others as well. And that is no big surprise here: distribute electricity, provide wireline, wireless cable services, so kind of communication services, enforcing law, and enforcing law. So those were the others that had a large number of connections. So again, looking at these dependencies allows us to understand all the possible pathways by which a climate hazard could disrupt an NCF. And then finally, sort of at the national scale, in terms of the climate hazards that affect a lot of disruption, we found there were 4: flooding, sea level rise, tropical cyclones, and wildfire affect a large number of climate hazards of critical infrastructure. And And we found that we do want to note this was done at the national scale. So there are really important regional differences. And we did see that when we looked at the Southeast and when we looked at the West and Pacific Islands. The different hazards have different effects. And we can kind of point those out. Back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Sue. And yeah, that's a good point. Just kind of on that latter point on the kind of regional versus national scale of the analysis. One of the things we found by being able to look at, I should say, be able to carry out this analysis over a number of different years and at multiple spatial scales is that climate hazards are regional. And doing this analysis at the national scale can be kind of difficult because you have concentrations of certain hazards like tropical cyclones in parts of the United States or drought in parts of the United States. And so in the past year and then, in future years, as we're able to continue this work, zooming into the regional, kind of the regional scale is really important to understand the nuances of how climate change can really play out and affect our critical infrastructure. Okay, Rahim, to you next, just to zoom back in, were there any other key findings from the analysis that were really interesting or stood out to you from the national critical functions that you looked at?
Yeah, I'd actually like to go back to, the point that Sue had mentioned about the upstream dependency of critical functions. The critical functions, most of the critical functions do not operate in isolation, and critical functions with a high number of upstream dependencies could be at additional risk from climate drivers. So for instance, one of the critical functions that I analyzed was related to the maintenance and operation of the high voltage electric transmission system. So we assessed that this critical function was currently at risk of minimal disruption, but increases to moderate disruption by the middle and end of the century. And the increase in risk and disruption is due to the increase in frequency and intensity of climate drivers that could cause faults to transmission lines or damage transmission line infrastructure or increase the need for maintenance on the electric transmission system. And so this assessment of the transmit electricity critical function was completed under the assumption that the kind of upstream dependencies would be operational. But the transmission of electricity is dependent on other critical functions, including electricity generation and supply chains. And so disruptions to either of those two critical functions could result in further disruptions or risk of disruptions to the electrical transmission critical function as well. So it starts to kind of, in some ways change the calculus a bit.
That's great. Thanks, Rahim. And then I want to turn finally back to Andy. So to talk a bit more about how this work could be used. So Andy, you come from a practitioner community, specifically state and local government. Looking at the study from that perspective, how would you use the information from the work, and what stands out to you?
Sure. So to me, the reason to do the work is there are two primary takeaways. One is that it changes your understanding of what your level of risk is to something, to one of the functions. And the second is it tells you something about how to mitigate that risk. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of examples for both of those. So with regard to how it might change your understanding of risk if you're a practitioner, the first thing is that, and Sue alluded to this, certain functions emerge that I think would not be ones that you would think in a traditional analysis of risk from climate change would be those that are at greatest risk. So Sue mentioned prepare for and manage emergencies. Another one is provide public safety. And I think we tend to think about climate change as physical effects. And so we think, well, you lose like a fire station, you lose a police station. It's not that big a deal. It's a big deal, but it's not going to disrupt your ability to provide services in that, in that city or statewide. But when you bring these other factors in, like demand, all of a sudden these functions rocket up to the top in terms of their risk. So it completely changes your perception of what your overall underlying level of risk is, right? Another thing that I think is useful about understanding your risk is just thinking about the concept of ownership. You'll read that like 80% of infrastructure is owned by the private sector. You'll hear terms like owner, operator. And I think that the functional approach, the NCFs and this sort of work, it makes it resonate a lot more to you as a practitioner, that just we're kind of all in this together. Like we've got all of these different interdependencies. I might own some things that I didn't think that I owned, or I own a critical part of somebody else's function, or they own a critical part of mine. And, at the end of the day, we invest in things that we think are going to impact our ability to do our own day-to-day operations. And I think it's really important to expand this idea of ownership. So you can't be thinking, well, I'm insulated from the risk because I'm inland, or I'm in a particular type of community, or I've done, some sort of an action to mitigate my risk, because that may not mean anything because of your interdependencies, or just because of the way that these functions are provided by so many different entities. So similarly, on the mitigation side, we thought hard about how to mitigate risk. And there are kind of two things that would jump out to me for the practitioner community. The one is where a single mitigation measure might give you a higher ROI because it touches so many different functions. And, our analysis is by no means complete on this, but when you begin to look at, risk through these different lenses of functions and particular drivers and geography, you can begin to see some economies of scale with geographically based risk mitigation measures, where you can say, well, I've got 6 NCFs that I'm a major stakeholder in. And if I take this one measure, even if it's more expensive, it'll mitigate risk to these 6 NCFs and then to these others that are downstream. And all of a sudden, it starts looking like a much more attractive proposition in terms of your return on investment. The other thing I would talk about, and just to be transparent, is gaps. There were plenty of areas where we did not have great mitigation measures. And the one I would single out, given my background, which is emergency management and homeland security, was the public safety NCFs, the emergency management public safety NCFs. We came up with a set of mitigation measures, and they are by and large things that the country is already doing. Things like mutual aid agreement, which we already have in place. Things like increasing the workforce, but public safety is really struggling with vacancies right now. It's not a matter of no one knowing that is a good solution or trying to fill those vacancies. It's that we simply can't do it. And so one of the values to me, putting the work out into the world like this, is to get other people thinking about this. And I would be thrilled if people can identify mitigation measures that we didn't identify. But I do think that knowing that we don't have good answers for risk to some of these functions is just as important as understanding where the risk is.
Or on that point that, there's a kind of baseline adaptive capacity of these systems that may have solutions that are already being pursued, and kind of strengthening that adaptive capacity through increased workforce, through training, through, whatever it is, can also help climate change. So there's a lot of co-benefits in existing strategies and existing systems. I think that's also another interesting point that kind of came out of some of our mitigation work.
And when you're painted into a corner, you get creative and you start thinking of solutions that you might not have thought of. And so if it's like, well, I can't increase my own workforce, whose workforce could I use? And I think, we saw some of this play out in COVID, for example, with people, changing functions, librarians, running vaccination centers, because there's a similar set of skills. There may be some opportunities in the climate change space as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I'm going to turn it to audience questions now. We'll, Andy, keep the mic to you first. Kind of back to the earlier points you were making on this kind of sector versus functional approach to critical infrastructure. Did you find, or did we find that focusing on this functional approach rather than sectors increased or decreased the overall risk?
Increased. I would say clearly increased. I think it was a result of this broader understanding of how the functions might be disrupted. And since we've already talked about that, a related point that I will hit on is I think it also, at least in my mind, increased on my understanding of the magnitude of the risk. So we are talking about national critical functions. So these are things that should essentially be too big to fail. Things like operate government, educate and train across the country. It should take a lot to knock them off kilter. And when you hear, Sue and Raheem talking about moderate disruption or major disruption, and Sue mentioned we didn't get into consequences. That was not in the scope of our analysis. a moderate disruption to a national critical function has major life-changing impacts across the country. And I don't know that using a non-functional approach that we would have understood that. And I think that, as we kind of think towards the future and directions we want to take the work, I think working on how we communicate that risk is something really important, because I think that we are beginning to see, unfortunately, the inconceivable become conceivable. And through this functional lens, you think about something like, conduct elections. Well, that was threatened during COVID. Educate and train was threatened during COVID. We are saying that several of these national critical functions are going to be seriously threatened as a result of climate change. So I think the functional approach definitely increased the amount of risk that we saw.
And I just want to foot stomp on what Andy said about sort of looking at the national scale and a 5-point risk rating scheme. I mean, a 3 is non-trivial, right? And there's a major part of the country that could have severe consequences. So I just want to foot stomp on that a little bit.
Yeah, and Sue, I would just add, a 3 is Katrina.
Yeah.
So, by this scale, the nation was not, national functions were not disrupted at a national level by Katrina, but huge impacts on life safety, the economy. So that's a 3.
And multiple states, yeah.
And multiple states for years.
Yeah, and Andy, that's exactly what I was going to say. Let's bring up Katrina. That's our nice grounding example to put this into context. I'm going to pivot a little bit now to a second audience question and throw this one to Raheem. Raheem, you were able to really deep dive into a few of these critical infrastructure systems. So based on the ones you looked at or your broader knowledge, you've been working in this space for a while, do you think our critical infrastructure managers and experts have enough knowledge and training on climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there are sources and there's a lot of years of research on this topic that's publicly available, and there are a lot of different resources and tools. But I think how infrastructure managers and experts kind of use that knowledge does vary, and it could be varying depending on a number of different factors. It could be kind of geographical variation. It could be the type of infrastructure that they manage. It could be the scale of infrastructure that they manage. So I think that there are resources available, but it can be challenging trying to make sense of all that. I mean, I think even just trying to collect and utilize climate change projection data and apply it to, kind of map it to what that means for operational needs for infrastructure and maintenance, it's challenging. And I think that's where this work and other similar types of work really kind of come in handy and really help to present to infrastructure managers, how to operationalize some of this data and be able to use it in their own management of infrastructure systems. And I think that there's always opportunities for more training and education. But I think maybe some standardization of that could also be useful as well.
Thanks, Raheem, and very much agreed. We've seen in a lot of our work, both in this project and in others, that, as you mentioned, it's more than just having access to the numbers. Where is climate change headed? Where are the hazards headed? There's an entire policy and implementation environment that needs to be addressed when developing solutions related to climate change. And often, a lot of the science can stop right at, your climate hazard is projected to increase 20% into the future, for a given critical infrastructure system or, what have you. And that's often not enough information for operators to really plan. Okay, Sue, I'm going to turn to you next for another audience question related to one of our favorite topics among the team, which is interdependencies. So we got a question about actually in the context of one of Raheem's comments related to upstream dependencies. So how were these dependencies considered in our risk assessment, or how weren't they?
Okay, so I alluded to this, but maybe I wasn't completely explicit. But we had to consider direct effects to the NCF, or the critical infrastructure. So each critical infrastructure, each function was looked at as direct effects only, and that is what is reflected in the risk rating. We do note these dependencies, so we know that there are dependencies, and we've presented information on how many upstream NCFs are at level 3, 4, or 5 risk. So that is a flag, or is an indicator that there could be more. We just didn't have enough information to actually kind of characterize those cascading or those indirect effects in a numerical value. So we presented as much information as we could to be consistent across all. Consistency, you can imagine that sort of the dimensionality of this problem is huge, and so we had to make some assumptions, or limit the focus of our analysis, and that was one area, unfortunately, that we couldn't dive into greater detail. But we do, again, like I said, present how many upstream NCFs are level 3, 4, or 5. So yeah.
Thanks, Sue. We'll turn to another audience question about future directions for the work and how do you expect the ratings to change. And let's start with Andy, with you on this one, and then we'll actually open it up to everyone in the group. But just to kind of restate, what are the future directions of this work, or where would you like to take it? And given those directions, do you expect risk ratings to change?
Oh, so I will limit myself to just a couple of thoughts here, because I have a long list in mind. First of all, things keep changing, so I think that it is very healthy to continually reevaluate the risk ratings, but also to reevaluate the NCFs themselves. As technology changes, what is a critical function is going to change. We may well see the rise of something that is not currently on the list, or that is subsumed in another function, just as a result of changes in technology and human behavior. Climate science is really tough, and the way that climate risk is manifesting continues to surprise us. And so we need to continue reevaluating things. If you consider that the impact of climate change is uncertain, changes in technology and how we provide functions are uncertain, human behavior, where people live, is uncertain, you're already at uncertainty times uncertainty times uncertainty. So we've got to keep doing this. Another thing I would say, and this is putting my practitioner hat back on, the way that climate science is framed, we typically look at these very long periods. So one of the periods we looked at, as Michelle mentioned, is the year 2100. And as the saying goes, in the long run, we're all dead. And we don't make investment decisions about mitigation in the long run, even if the long run is 10 years, unfortunately, in many cases. So I think that going back to some of my earlier comments about how we communicate risk and the seriousness of the consequences of some of the risks that we are projecting, and think about how to think more in the period of a policymaker's lifetime, of our lifetime, of when we're going to be seeing these impacts, I think is really, those are two really important directions. And the last thing I would say, just real quickly, we looked at 2 different scenarios. I think for climate change, I think it would be useful to consider some alternative additional scenarios. And this gets back to my point before about when you have a wicked problem, I think the more lenses you can apply, the better. And so I think we should consider a more broad range of scenarios, some even worse scenarios than what we're looking at, and see what that teaches us, see what the implications would be of those things, because it might send us in some new directions. And frankly, they might be things that actually happen in our lifetimes.
Sue or Raheem, just want to be all, Sue, you're off mic first. You want to take that question next?
Yeah, I think, well, I've got a couple. So just sort of a softball one on the interdependencies. I mean, we're actually working to try to incorporate more information and provide a better understanding of how these risks could cascade. So that is an area of that we see constant improvement on. We are a little strapped in that we have to look, in recent years at a regional scale across 55. So it has to be kind of consistent. I mean, that's, I think, one of the benefits of our study is that we're looking on the sort of a level playing field across all of these functions, but then that only can take you so far, right? So I would say in the future, like continuing to kind of work in that domain, I think would be important. And then the other areas, I think, to the extent we can help with implementation of adaptation or risk mitigation measures, I think there's a lot that needs to be done there. Having done some work in prior years on environmental technology, it's more than just having a positive ROI. It's these investments are competing with other investments that could increase revenue. So that decision making process incorporates a lot of different factors. And I think also being able to kind of take sort of these high level findings and kind of bring them down to kind of the local effects, because those are so important when you're making investment decisions. So how do you sort of translate some of this broad brush work at a local, that's meaningful at a localized level, and then dealing with uncertainty, because climate, I mean, there's uncertainty in other sort of decisions, the investment decisions, no doubt, but because of this uncertainty here, I think people tend to kind of push things off, but that's probably not the right strategy. In fact, it's not the right strategy. So trying to kind of get that thinking and to Andy's point, in that sort of policy relevant time frame, and kind of communicating and motivating sort of that decision making, I think, and giving people ways of dealing with uncertainty, I think, is really important.
And I think some other points I'd like to add to what Sue and Andy already mentioned, and actually maybe also just going back to what, how Andy kind of described this problem. It's a wicked problem. Climate change is a wicked problem, and there are multiple lenses in which to kind of view that problem. And as an analyst kind of going through and assessing some of these critical functions, one question kind of always was running through my mind when going through the assessment is, well, what does this depend on, or how, what types of factors depend on the risk rating? Even going back to the idea of, infrastructure and maintenance, does the municipality have funding available to be able to invest in maintenance activities to respond to future climate drivers? That could change the risk rating. Are there policies in place in a given region that allow for better adaptation measures for certain critical functions? That could change the risk rating. And so, with this research, I think there's a lot of different types of lenses that could be applied, whether it's looking at vulnerability, looking at adaptation, looking at mitigation. And I think all of those can really help to enhance the risk rating and provide a better kind of depiction of what critical functions require further attention and warrant further investigation and examination, and which ones maybe in certain regions might require additional attention from infrastructure managers or state officials, or require some sort of policy making. So that's where I kind of see additional areas to pursue this research, and I think all of those would change some of the risk ratings of this. This is both climate change and kind of the definitions of these functions is dynamic, and so because of those, there are updates that could be made and variations.
And just circling back to that last point about, and kind of the latter half of the question on whether risk ratings will change, and anyone want to have any last words on that? I think probably the consensus would be probably yes, they'll change, but the big question mark is, will they go up or down?
So if our assessment is correct, first of all, we're saying for 7 of the climate hazards, risk will go up over time, and we would expect to see that carry through to the NCFs. The one where it's not going up is extreme cold, because we're having the opposite problem, which is extreme heat. I think the wild card would be twofold. One is we've learned something every year we've done the project. I would love to say that the very first time that we looked at climate change risks to the NCFs, we understood everything perfectly, but we're getting more sophisticated in our analysis, I think, and that's caused us to change and refine some of our ratings, generally for the worse, unfortunately. But then also there is the prospect of mitigation. The thing that makes the project so complicated to do is that there are all these different combinations. You have 55 NCFs, you have 8 climate hazards, you have 3 impact mechanisms. But the benefit of that is it also gives you a lot of attack surfaces to mitigate risk. And so if serious investments are made in those areas, we can begin to reduce risk. And hopefully we've got a pretty holistic understanding of what are some of the major avenues of risk. Not saying that we have done a perfect job and identified all of them, but I certainly think we've got a good set of places to start looking to reduce risk.
Thanks, Andy. So we have about maybe time for one more short question before we wrap up, and I might just, hit a couple of these myself quickly. So there was one question about how risk ratings are affected as key indicators of climate change are observed to change and as we move forward in time. So the easiest way to answer that question is by talking about our 2 scenarios that we looked at. So for those who know the lingo, we looked roughly at RCP 4.5 and 8.5, which was that current and high emissions. So if we think about, emissions as a major driver of climate change, nearly all of our risk ratings I should say a majority of our risk ratings are greater in RCP 8.5 and that high emissions rating. So that's a major driver of climate change and a major driver of our risk ratings. So as climate change worsens due to greater emissions in that particular scenario, ratings do go up. So I would just briefly answer the question that way, although there were a number of other factors that we looked at as well. And then finally, very quickly, any plans to map risk to geography? We also love this topic, and I would love to talk a bit more about it. But just to say that in each individual risk rating, our analysts do look at GIS data if it's available and as it's relevant. And we've also developed kind of an internal tool we use on the project that uses downscaled climate model projections and maps those to the states in the US. And has some sub-state city level data as well. So we have that internal kind of GIS-based climate data tool that we're working with. And with that, I will turn it back to, thank you all, and turn it back to Vice President Woods to close.
Thank you, Michelle. I want to thank everyone again for coming today. It was great to see such a varied audience to attend this webinar. Thank you very much. Special thanks to our panel for your thought-provoking and informative discussion, and I am truly grateful that you are members of our team and that you're tackling such important issues. A recording of today's conversation will be posted in a few days on RAND.org, so please keep your eye out for that. HSRD will be hosting more of these public events in the near future, so please stay tuned. And finally, if you would like to learn more about RAND's Homeland Security research, please send an email to hsrd@rand.org to be added to our mailing list. Again, thank you very much, and we look forward to more of these events.